What they told her is that she had HIV, not because she actually had HIV, but they told her that in a ploy to get her to give them something that would help propel their sexual deviant theory.
But she didn't actually have HIV, right?
No, not at all.
And he, in response to that, was like, well, maybe you should have thought about that before you had sex with all those people. You should think about who gave you HIV. And so I went immediately back to my room and wrote down a list of all of the sexual partners I had ever had in my life up to that point. I think it was 7 people my entire life. And I wrote down what kind of protection I had used and how confused I was, how I thought I was dying. And the very next day, the Vice Comandante came into my room with a couple other prison guards and confiscated everything that I had ever written on in those, few weeks in my cell, and confiscated that entry of my journal that had my list of sexual partners. And within days, that list was being broadcast in the media as this American whore who had slept with all these people while she was in Italy and participated in this sex game gone wrong. I mean, the whole issue of how sex was both portrayed in this case and also used to sell this case in the media has always been deeply, deeply troubling to me, because it wasn't just like a commentary on my sexuality. Like, my sexuality was commented on like crazy, to the extent that people were, sexualizing me even as I was being walked into the courtroom and like talking about what clothes that I was wearing, but even commentary about Meredith's sexuality and how she was depicted as necessarily, there was this whole like whore, Madonna whore dichotomy, where it wasn't, Meredith was also a sexually active young woman, and she was made out to be this like emblem of purity, who she would, never have casual sex. And that's the only way a victim can be, is a young woman who has a boyfriend and is a serious young girl, and she is a pure victim, as if there's like something wrong with a young woman having casual sex while she's out in the world experiencing life and getting to know people. Like, Meredith is also allowed to have a casual sexuality, and that was erased as well.
I think what Amanda is talking about here speaks to a larger social issue, one that I know was especially hammered into us growing up in a super religious community, but one that all sects of society have kind of adopted, that women aren't really allowed to be sexual, or if we are, it defines us or will be used to frame our story in whatever way makes people most comfortable. Like, you can be sexual and be a victim. You can be a sexual being and not be a devious monster, but society often doesn't know how to deal with a woman's sexuality. And so the media put Meredith and Amanda into boxes, and Amanda was framed as this American enchantress with an insatiable appetite for sex, who had not one but 2 men, Rudy and Raffaele, so far under her seductive spell that they didn't even hesitate to kill for her. Even as the evidence kept coming in that pointed unilaterally at one of their suspects, Rudy. And Amanda told me that the whole time this was happening, she was just patiently waiting for everyone to wake up and realize that none of it made sense, that she wasn't involved and had never been involved in the murder of her friend.
One of the more devastating things about this situation is, so while I was sitting there basically waiting for sane people to rationally observe what was going on and to figure out that I had nothing to do with this and let me go home. Like, I spent 2 years while the investigation was ongoing and the trial went through. It took 2 years for me to finally receive a verdict. I was convinced that I was going home, that it was only a matter of time, that I just had to get through the process, and that ultimately a independent group of people who were not emotionally invested and had their egos involved in proving me guilty would rationally see that I had nothing to do with this. So it was devastating to me when that turned out to not be the case, and that however insane and nonsensical and bereft of proof the prosecution's theory was, it was captivating or convincing enough to people to want to put me in prison for 26 years.
But the conviction was overturned, right?
Yes, eventually, after 4 years in prison, and she got to go home. And that's the point at which Amanda finally kind of exhaled and thought, okay, it's actually over. She could go back to Seattle and away from the British tabloid press and finally get back to her life. Except it wasn't over, not even close.
But I did not have an understanding about what my reality was going to be. I thought that once I was acquitted, and more I hoped, and in some prosecutor's imagination, and I just wanted to go back to my life. I just wanted to go back to being anonymous student Amanda Knox. And I came home with this vision for myself that I was going to get to do that. And it didn't take long for me to realize that that was not the case. I mean, from the moment I landed in Seattle, there was a press conference waiting for me and helicopters following me on the way home and paparazzi stationed outside my family's house, and we had to draw the curtains and hide. And that went on for months and months. And after a while, they, weren't camping out in front of my mom's lawn anymore, but I couldn't go out on my bicycle to ride to school without the occasional paparazzo taking a picture of me and it being plastered in the tabloids, or being in the middle of class and having classmates take pictures of me and post them to social media with really unkind commentary. And I realized painfully that I was an idea of a person more so than a person in people's minds. I was a character in this ongoing entertainment morality play, and that I was always and forever going to be seen through the lens of this case, and in particular, this version of me in the public's imagination, the Foxy Knoxy vision of me. I was forever going to be in conversation with that, because it was like this veil through which everyone would see me and judge me moving forward.
The whole time I was talking to Amanda, I just found myself getting so angry about the way she'd been treated and how loaded the dice had been from the very start. And I kept thinking, why? Why had investigators trained their sights so squarely on her? And when I asked her, she thinks she knows.
The question of why has been one of the ones that has tortured me the most throughout this entire experience, because it seems so clearly like this didn't need to happen, right? Like within a few weeks, they had definitive DNA, fingerprints and footprints that were from Rudy Gaudet in Meredith's blood. Like, this was a very, very clear case. I know that some people think that my prosecutor was a psychopath, that just didn't care, that he was wrong and he just pursued the case so that he didn't have to admit that he was wrong. I don't think that. I'm not convinced that that's the reason why the prosecution and the cops pursued this case against me, despite all of this evidence pointing to someone completely different and that nothing pointing to me. I tend to think that it comes down to a more subtle issue of cognitive bias. And what do I mean by that? There are lots of ways that because we're such intelligent, nuanced thinkers, human beings, there are tons of ways that we can very intelligently and subtly trick ourselves into thinking that we're doing the right thing when we're not. And one of those biases is called the conservative bias, where you have an idea about something. In this case, Amanda is guilty. Amanda is involved in this crime. And you get new information that challenges that assumption. But instead of totally revamping your assumptions or your beliefs about something, you instead try to incorporate that new information in such a way that it continues to confirm your already pre-existing belief. So in this case, the cops believed that I was involved or believed that they weren't wrong. And so any new information that they came across in relation to the case was twisted to reconfirm their already pre-existing held belief. And this is ultimately what it all comes down to, is investigators going into cases, if they go in with a pre-existing belief about what happened, they're going to find what they want to find. They're going to look for evidence to confirm that held belief, and they're going to overlook evidence that suggests otherwise. So in the case of my prosecutor, when zero DNA evidence placed me at the crime scene, he said that I must have cleaned up my DNA. I must have cleaned up my DNA and left all of Meredith's blood everywhere and Rudy Gaday's DNA there. Somehow been able to distinguish between my DNA and his in order to clean up the crime scene and frame Rudy Gaday. That was the ultimate idea of my prosecutor, was that I tried to frame Rudy Gaday to take the fall for this crime that I orchestrated and that Rudy Gaday participated in, but wasn't the ultimate responsible party for. And that kind of mental gymnastics seems super extreme, but if anything, I've come to learn that we are all guilty of extreme mental gymnastics when it comes to beliefs, especially when they impact how we think of ourselves. So I think that my prosecutor thought of himself as a good investigator, as a good person, and as someone who was doing his due diligence and his duty to this case. And the idea that he could have not only prosecuted, but even a little bit framed an innocent person, because if you frame the case as no matter what the evidence says, Amanda's guilty, I think that he couldn't bring himself to believe that he could have been that wrong. And that's why he pursued the case to the nth degree that he did.
That's truly an evolved way to look at the world, and I'm not sure I could be so forgiving after an experience like that.
Listen, Amanda says it's been a process, that she had to essentially rebuild her entire life and her entire vision of herself from the ground up.
Realizing that